Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bob Hendershot. I teach world history here at the college, and it's my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our afternoon speaker, GRCC history professor Susan Williams. This is our inaugural History of Gender and Sexuality conference here at GRCC, and I believe that it will be the first of many of its kind. And Professor Williams has really been the driving force behind this, and her talk today promises to be extremely interesting, but I did want to just give you a little bit of background information right on Professor Williams. She took her Master's of Arts at the University of Cincinnati, right? She studied modern and early modern European history, and she's currently about to finish her PhD at Indiana University in Bloomington, where her focus is modern East European history and the history of gender and sexuality, with a minor in Russian and East European studies. Her dissertation focuses on Romani nationalism in Romania during the interwar period, the period between the world wars. And she's looking at how a Romani identity was constructed. And she also deals with how and why the West constructed gypsies in their imaginations. And in this work, she has been the recipient of very prestigious fellowship funding from the Fulbright organization and from the Mellon Foundation. And she's conducted years of extensive research, well based primarily in Bucharest. She's also built an impressive publication record with recent articles appearing in journals such as the Anthropology of Eastern Europe Review and the Journal of Romani Studies. I'd also like to say that next semester she'll be offering a new course here at the college that she has created called The History of Gender and Sexuality. And that course is, well, we're in enrollment, now or soon, right? And if you're interested, and you should be, sign up, right? It's going to fill very quickly from all the interest I've heard about this particular course. It's HS 225. But anyway, today, Professor Williams is presenting a paper entitled From Devourer of Man to the Sparklepire, Gender, Sexuality, and the Vampire. Please help me to welcome Professor Susan Williams.
I made you say Sparklepire. Well, thanks. I guess I should start off by saying, we'll get to the whole Sparklepire part of this. I know some people might not know. That's an internet term, but we'll talk about that as we go along in the class. I guess I got to talk to you about why it is that I came up with this paper for this conference. For one thing, I'm really interested in popular culture, but for another thing, I did a talk last year on the history of the romance novel, and I had a number of students walk up to me afterwards and actually say, what do you think about the Twilight novels? What do you think about these movies? What do you think about this or this? And they really wanted to know more, and I only have about an hour and 10 minutes, right, to give a presentation. I couldn't include that kind of stuff. And so they asked me to give this paper this year, and so I figured it would be fun, right? But just to get into, a lot of people, when they think about history, they think about people needing to know dates, times, places, right? Certain societies. So when we bring up the fact of, we had a movie showing last night, right? And so, and some of the questions seem to be, focused on why were we showing a movie for a history conference? And so I kind of wanted to get in with you a little bit at the beginning here about why it is that historians study popular culture, and how the heck do vampires and popular culture, fit into this conference in particular. So if you think about popular culture versus what people might term high culture, popular culture, as historians see it, is kind of the study of society from the bottom up. Right? The reason that high culture is created, and when we talk about high culture, we're talking about things like symphony, opera, right? Things that you have to be educated to understand, that they're supposed to be appreciated, maybe sometimes not even enjoyed that much, but appreciated. They're supposed to edify society. They're supposed to encourage you to be a better human being, right? A better citizen. And it's a very top-down process, right? This high culture is typically created by, the wealthiest 10% of the population in history. And so when we talk about popular culture is an expression of what a general culture, what general society enjoys, right? And by studying what you enjoy, and also what you desire, right? Through that analysis, it can tell us about, the general desires of society in general, can tell us more about that society, more about the larger part of the population. And then when you add gender and sexuality to this, right? And when we talk about gender and sexuality, what we're talking about is cultural and and social constructions and performances of masculinities and femininities and the concept of desire, that's when we can really, we can take a look at gender and sexuality, we can bring it together with popular culture. And if you start looking at a long stretch of history, and today I'm going to cover, believe it or not, in an hour, Mesopotamia to the modern day, we can actually look at how concepts of gender and sexuality have changed throughout this, what we would call a longue durée of history, this long stretch. Right? So why vampires then? Vampires are around in every culture, right? We're going to talk about kind of the origins of this mythology. And starting with Babylonia, when we talk about Lamashtu and Lilitu, and I want to talk, when I go through, what I'm going to do is talk about how the concept of vampires change, how they fit into society in these different periods. We're going to talk about these ancient civilizations. We're going to talk about peasant culture. I'll do a little bit on world history just to give you a sense of how widespread these ideas about vampires are. And then we'll get into the 19th century and the 20th century. And then at the very end, I'll conclude and we'll start thinking, and we can talk about this in the question and answer session as well, start thinking about what we can say about looking at vampires in our society today and how they're constructed. What does this mean about us, and what does this mean about our concepts of gender, sexuality, and desire? Right? But getting into Lamashtu and Lilitu, we're talking about Babylonia, ancient civilizations. And what's really interesting, Lamashtu is one of the first, what we could say is a vampiric-like character. And one of the interesting things about ancient societies and their perceptions of these bloodsuckers, that's one of the lines that I'm drawing here. We've got to think about what a vampire is, and we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into peasant traditions from Eastern Europe. But what's really tying all of these characters together is this drinking of blood, right? Which, of course, blood's your life essence, and even ancient societies understood that. One of the cures for ancient vampires is to crack an egg over a coffin, with the idea being that an egg is also a symbol of life, right? So you're canceling it out if you do this procedure. What's really interesting as well about these ancient societies and these vampires in ancient societies, vampire-like characters in ancient societies, is the fact that they're all women. Lamashtu is an ancient demon, shows up, actually pre-Babylonian. She's basically a devourer of children. And this is one of the things that we see through all of these characters, Lamashtu, Lilitu, the Striges in Greece, the Impusiae, the Lamiae. They tend to be very, originally the stories about them are always that they're very beautiful women. They've somehow been wronged, or they feel like they've been wronged in life. They don't actually live up to the gender roles assigned to women in this period, and so therefore they're somehow punished by the gods. And they're punished, their punishment is that they become revenant. So in other words, they die, they're born again, and what they're going to do is drink the blood of babies or pregnant women in particular. So you have a situation where it's a woman being punished by doing the most horrible thing in the time that a woman could do, right? Women in this period were seen as ultimate nurturers, the mother. And so by punishing in this way, right, they're just repeating their crimes of not living up to the gender roles that they were assigned. Lilith is really interesting. I don't know, has anybody heard of Lilith before? This is a really interesting myth if you haven't heard about it. And this comes out of ancient Babylonia. And it's also, of course, there's cross-cultural assimilation in this general region. It's actually going to stay in Hebrew mythology from this point on. Lilith is the first wife of Adam. Adam actually had a wife before Eve, according to this myth. The problem was that Lilith was a very strong character. She didn't like Adam telling her what to do. She was in the Garden of Eden with him. Didn't like him telling her what to do. Didn't like him trying to be this masculine husband figure. She would constantly tell him no. She would constantly tell him that she wasn't going to live under his authority. And what happens is she's actually kicked out of the garden. And then God creates Eve, right, who's supposed to be the perfect submissive wife and live up to the gender roles. And what happens, Lilith is cast out of the garden, and she becomes the queen of demons in the underworld. So she becomes the ultimate evil character for not living up to what was expected of her as a woman. And so Lilith and all of her followers, all of the female demons, who are going to be created after her in her image, actually roam around the countryside and they kill babies. They drink the baby's blood. That's Lilith's function in life. And we see the continuation of this myth of Lilith when we talk about Greek concepts, and this is very interesting. The Striges, I don't remember if I have an image. I don't have an image of that. Oh, I should show you the image of, sorry. This is Lilitu. And so what's really interesting, as time goes on in Babylonia, because there's this general idea that you become somehow warped when you're reborn, Lilitu is often shown with the feet of owls, right? And you see the owls on the opposite sides of her. And this is, a concept of Lilith, right? That's this very lascivious, naked woman wrapped with the serpent, right? Serpent, sin. We're going to see this imagery again. She's enjoying the sexual attentions of this serpent, right? She's decadent. This is somebody who you're never going to be able to bring back. She's evil at heart, and we're gonna talk about these things as we go along. So the Striges are basically the Greek concept of Lilitu. So of course we see this kind of cross assimilation, right? The Striges are owl-like creatures. Again, they roam the countryside. And their purpose is to underline, right, that women should be careful while they're pregnant. Women should protect their children at all times. You would threaten expectant mothers with, you need to live up to your role, you need to take care of your babies, you need to stay in the house, you need to, protect your family, because if you don't, the Lilitu could come, right? Or the Striges could come. And so, and this partly goes in, and I should say something about Greek society. When we're talking about the people who really talk about Striges and Impusiae and Lamii, we're talking about Athenian society. Anybody know anything about Athens and gender roles in Athens? A little bit. One person, right? Athenian society was incredibly conservative when it came to gender roles. Women were not allowed outside of the home unless they had a male companion to walk them along the streets. Women were supposed to stay in one room of their home at all times, unless they were actually needed in another section of the home. Women often were actually veiled when they went out into public, so that no man could gaze upon them other than their brothers or their fathers or their husbands. You were actually not allowed to carry any more money than could buy a bushel of grain. So you're not even trusted with basic finances, right? Only enough to buy you, a little bit of groceries for the day. And so, of course, when you talk about mythology and when you talk about, part of mythology is a moral tale. And so when you talk about these kinds of characters, what you're doing is giving people a life lesson, right, that they're supposed to live by. It's supposed to give you a moral compass. And so it makes sense that Athens, which was so conservative, the men who are writing in Athens are going to give this very, very conservative idea of the behavior of women and how you get punished, right? The Striges, the creation myth about the Striges. There's a woman named Polyphonte, and she loved Aphrodite, the goddess Aphrodite, so much she worshipped her, right? Which is normal. You worship your gods or your goddesses. But she was one of her followers. She loved her so much that Aphrodite said, enough. You need to stop loving me and you need to go find a husband. And when Polyphontes said no, and Aphrodite kept insisting, so Polyphontes decided, that's it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and worship another goddess. I'm going to go worship Athena. And because she didn't follow the role that was set up for her, right, that the goddess is trying to push her into, Aphrodite punishes her. And she makes her fall in love with a bear. Anybody know the astrological symbol of Gemini? Bears, right? So what happens, she has two sons. They're half bear, half human. But of course, bears like a little meat on the side occasionally, and her sons end up being cannibals. And ultimately, she's punished for the fact that she made this sin that made her children sin, right? And this is something we're going to see in peasant society as well. That she made her children sin through her sin. And so she gets turned into a Striges, right? And so everybody who does something horrific. And for men, I kid you not, it's cannibalism. For women, it's deciding not to get married, right? That's one of the ways that you can become a strige. So that tells you something about gender roles in this society. Women who abandon their children. Women who of course, women who sleep around too much. These are things that can predestine you to become one of these striges, right? So it's not about you getting bitten, like we think about with vampires, but it's about morally you doing something horrific, right? And for women, that line's a little bit, more nebulous than men. For the impucia, this is a really interesting story too. So you have, of course, the Greeks like they like to be very strided in all of their gods and goddesses. There's tons of different kinds, but just to pick out a few. The impucia. Impucia was the daughter of Hecate and Mormo. Mormo's really interesting because he's kind of one of these lesser deities, and the only reason he's around is if Greek parents, you threaten your children with him. Mormo comes at night and he bites at you. He nibbles at you. And so if your children won't go to sleep, you say, if you don't go to sleep, Mormo's coming to get you, right? And Hecate, has anybody heard of that name before? This is an interesting goddess. She was a goddess that was around for quite a while. She's an old Babylonian concept of a goddess. The Greeks didn't really know what to do with her. She ends up becoming a goddess of the underworld. But she's it's one of these old matriarchal earth deities who just shows up in Greek culture. And as I said before, she's a goddess of the underworld. So of course, okay, you got the guy who likes to pinch at you at night and nibble at you at night, and Hecate, who's also, later on, she becomes the goddess of spells, for example, witchcraft, right? So that's your daughter, so of course Impucia is gonna have a rough lot in life. Very beautiful, yet again, very seductive, and what she would do is she would seduce men, have sex with them, and then drink their blood until they go insane and die. Lamia is another one of these Impucia-like characters. She was actually a mythological queen of Libya. And this is one of those horrific Greek stories. She had sex with Zeus. Now everybody knows the story's not going to end well, because the second that you have sex with Zeus, who gets mad at you? Hera, right? Hera finds out, his wife finds out about this affair. She had a number of children with him, and Hera forces her to kill her own children, and then cuts off her eyelids so that she constantly has to look at the world and remember what she did. She becomes a Lamia, and what she does is she roams around the countryside and she eats other people's children. She drinks their blood. And she also, what she'll do too, she'll be really nice to you if you're a pregnant woman. She'll be the neighbor that suddenly shows up on your doorstep and tells you everything's okay and that she'll help you out, because what she's waiting for you to do is to have your baby so that she can come at night and drink its blood. Right? So again, we just see this myth over and over and over again. Right? And just to give you a general sense, as I said before, why study vampires? These myths you see them in Africa, you see them in Asia, you see them in the Americas. There is this obsession with this idea, and part of this, I mean, think about it, the one thing you're trying to avoid in life is dying. But if you die, in a lot of cultures, at least you're going to be at peace. So people are really, really worried in the ancient world about this idea that something's going to cause you to live on, right? You suffer in this life. You suffer on earth. And so if you actually, if you can't get off of it, you never move on, right? They're very, very nervous about this. And it's going to be a nervousness that really increases with Christianity, and we'll talk about that as we get to it. But just to give you a general sense about where you see other of these types of characters, the goddess Kali in India. She's really interesting. I'm not saying that, Hindus are vampires. But I'm saying that this is a very interesting, an interesting representation of this theme that we're talking about. Kali is, typically the ancient worship of her was, one of the stories about Kali, of course, as you see here, she has fangs. She actually she wears a necklace of skulls around her neck, and she drinks blood. And so the goddess Kali, I should say too, most of her temples were actually, they were actually created next to, any place you wanted to worship her, were actually created next to places where you would cremate bodies. And so, so you see this continuation, in this culture as well, or a representation in this culture as well. And in Malaysia, this is really interesting. The Malaysian variety of this is real. I think that there should be a movie on this one, and I would be the first person in line. The Malaysian variety of a vampire does the same thing. Unlike Kali, Kali does not seek out babies. She's one of the only exceptions, actually, in the ancient world to this mythology. But the Malaysian version, they seek out babies. They float around the countryside at night, and they're just going house to house, village to village, looking for infants. But what they can do is they can detach their heads and they can chuck it at the baby. So that if you have a bunch of people trying to protect the child, you just chuck the head at it, right? The fangs are still attached, and it just grabs on, right? And then it can actually be put back on the body again. So I thought that was kind of innovative, actually. Oh, and I should talk too. We were talking about life forces with blood, but what's the other life force that people think about? What keeps you going? What makes you happy?
Breath.
What? I couldn't hear you. Breath. Breathing, sure. What's another thing? Sex, right? Succubi and incubi. Okay, so succubi are the female version. Incubi, we finally got a man. Now, and I should say, the strigays, you can have male versions, but like I said before, you have to do something pretty heinous to become a strigays as a man. But succubi and incubi, what they do, instead of drinking blood, they have sex with you until you die. The mythology about and how they reproduce is interesting. The succubi will actually have sex with somebody. She'll go, so of course there's a deposit of semen. She'll go and have sex with the incubi, and the incubi will take that deposit and have the child. Right? So there's a different kind of concept of birthing right there. But everybody's really, there were all kinds of, when you worry about succubi and incubi, if somebody looks really tired. We'll talk about symptoms of vampirism in a second, but succubi and incubi, it was usually somebody looking really, really peaked and tired, that they would get worried. And this is where dreams of people, you'll see this in the Middle Ages, people have dreams that something's sitting on their chest, or that they were touched during the night. But it's always in this dreamlike state that the succubi and the incubi come to you, right? And then, of course, what they do is they wear you down over a month or two, which is a good, I mean, if you want to think about this rationally, scientifically, it's a great way to explain a wasting sickness, right? Those sicknesses that people in the Middle Ages, in particular in the ancient world, just couldn't understand. Somebody looked like they were doing really well, and then they didn't really have any symptoms. They just kept getting more and more tired and thinner. And then one day they just kind of wasted away. I'll probably flip back to some of these images from the Victorian period when we get to it, because have you noticed anything strange about these pictures from the Victorian era? That one. It's like 1909, 1892. Anyone notice lack of clothing?
Like exposed women.
The sexualized image of women, right? I mean, it's just a complete overuse of nipples in particular. And we'll get back to this. We'll talk about what changes, right? Because right now, we're at that devourer of man, right? These women, if you let them loose in the countryside, they could destroy humanity. They're eating your children. So why is it we get to the point of Sparklepires? But we're getting to that in this conversation, right? So let's talk about peasant traditions, because this is actually really cool. And I, like you heard in the introduction, I mean, I study East European history. I've been to the countryside. I know some of these traditions. And so we're going to look at a couple examples, just to give you a sense, though, about the peasantry in Europe. We're going to focus on Europe for the rest of this talk. Just to give you a sense about what we're talking about, you're talking about people, particularly in Southeast Europe, who grew up very, very poor. And it's poor in a way that Americans cannot understand. You don't have a TV if you're a peasant. And I'm not talking about the 1700s. I'm talking about 10 years ago. You work. Your whole family works. The children work every single day for hours. Right? It's a very difficult life. And any kind of change that you make in that life, you make an agricultural change, you make a social change, it can threaten you, right? It can threaten the social fabric of your village. And ultimately, it can starve you. It can hurt you, right? So peasants tend to be very conservative, and I don't mean politically in that sense. What I mean is they tend to like status quo. They don't tend to like change very much. And so what's cool about looking at peasant traditions in Europe, particularly in Southeast Europe, is the fact that a lot of these villages have really held on to old traditions, some of them that come straight out of those Greek traditions. And they're still practicing them up to about 15, 20 years ago. And so anthropologists in particular have done us a big favor at looking at these traditions, and that's what we're going to get into now, talk about a few of these. So I'm going to use a couple of examples. Like I said, this is a worldwide phenomena, so I'm going to pick out the Romanian case. It's the one I'm most familiar with, and also the Romani. Romani's a word, Americans call them gypsies, and a lot of people in Western Europe call them gypsies. You're actually supposed to call them Roma. It's the Romani culture. So I'm going to talk about the strigoi and the mulo. And we'll talk about how it is that you can, who's at risk for becoming a vampire, and what the heck do you do? And we've already talked about the blood thing. What the heck do you do when you find one of these things, right? Or you suspect? Because unlike witch trials, which is really interesting, we're going to talk about the 18th century vampire craze in the Austrian Empire in just a second. A little bit after you're having the witch craze in Western Europe, what you have happening in East Europe is mass panic about vampires. The strigoi. Now these are, Romanians are utilitarian. They're not like the Greeks. They don't need 100,000 different words to describe different varieties of demons or witches or anything like that. They're just going to use one, and that's strigoi. And what the strigoi are, and I should say the reason I talk about the Balkans in particular, this Balkan area, is because people in Germany and people in England are going to get really attracted to these stories, and then you're going to get Bram Stoker's Dracula, right? So a lot of things that we think about, things from, vampire myths from Malaysia, like I told you about, toss the head at babies, right? That doesn't seem familiar to us about vampires. But a lot of what they think about vampires are going to come and be repeated, and it become part of our understanding of what a vampire is. So just to give you a sense, mulo is basically the Romani understanding of this strigoi. And I'm going to bring them together and just tell you about how it is that these things happen and how this fits into a conversation about gender and sexuality. So for instance, one of the ways that you can become a strigoi or a mulo is if you don't do what your society tells you you're supposed to do, if you don't behave the way that you're supposed to behave. So again, it's not necessarily about you getting bitten by one of these creatures. That comes around later. It's all about you living up to roles in your society. And if you step outside of that, and if you think about peasants, like I just said, right, you can't do it in a traditional society. They need everybody within a village to fit into a certain role, particularly gender roles. So for instance, if you think about strigoi, if you die before you're married, you are at risk of becoming a strigoi. And so what Romanian peasants would often do is they would have a fake wedding after the person dies. So they would have somebody come in and stand next to the coffin. They would marry them after death, right? If you have a young couple that died about the same time, you would marry them after death because it's your job to get married and to have babies, right? And if you don't do that, you're not living up to the expectations that culture had of you, and you're in danger. If you have any kind of strange, if you're born with any kind of what they would consider a strange characteristic, that can be anything like a big birthmark. It can be, you have an extra nipple. It can be that you were born with a tail. It can be anything. You're born too much hair. You're born with not enough hair. You're born with red hair. You're right there. Romanians very, very nervous, and Southeast European cultures in general, because they tend to be dark-haired, right? They're really, really nervous about that whole redhead and blue eyes. You have red hair and blue eyes, you might as well just give it up. And I see a couple of you out in the audience, so avoid them after the talk. So what you have to do, and I should say too, there are also other instances. For one thing, this will sound kind of strange to you. Say you're sitting on the ground and an animal walks up to you and they jump over you. It's like a black cat walking in front of you, right? If they jump over you, you're at risk. Trying to remember, I actually have my notes for this because there's so many rules and regulations about strigois. They don't come up with a ton of different names, but they have their regulations down, right? If you were actually, so if you're sitting there, you can do it. If it happens to you in life, if you died and an animal sits on you or it walks across you, you're actually at risk for this. Because to them, there's something luring that animal to you. There's something unnatural, right? The animal should avoid that. Another thing, if you're born with what's called a caul, have you guys ever heard of this before? C-A-U-L? What a caul is when you have a birth, but the sac hasn't broken yet. And so sometimes the sac will kind of attach itself to the baby's arm or part of the baby's head when it's coming out, right? If the baby, and you're supposed to expel after birth, right? That's why it's named that. But if the baby's born with that attached to them still, that's a sign that there's something abnormal in the birth, and so therefore that baby is marked, right, to become the strigoi. So there are a few things that you can do. And I should say something about Roma culture, because this is interesting. It tells you something about Roma in general. One of the things with Roma, and I'm talking about nomadic Roma, not people who've settled down and see themselves as part of a community, and there are plenty who do that. But traditional Romani culture, one of the things that you have to do, because you're not supposed to amass wealth. If you amass wealth, that means you're too connected with the world, which means that you're just a gajo. You're just one of those Europeans. Right? So one of the things you have to do when somebody dies is you have to burn all of their possessions, including cash, right? Everything. If you don't do that for your kinsperson, you become a strigoi. So as you see, if you don't look the way you're supposed to look, or if you don't live up to the expectations, the life pattern that you're supposed to go through, the social behaviors that you're supposed to interact in, then you're at risk of becoming one of these. And just there's all kinds of rituals too about what the heck do you do. One of the things that you can do, a lot of traditional peasant villages in Romania, they will actually bury the body face down in the grave, with the idea being that you don't want it to be able to look up and get out of the coffin, right? You want to confuse it. The other thing that you can do, they would actually open up graves about 5 to 7 times a year. And what you would do when you did, it's very respectful. I mean, this isn't just cranking something open, checking, and shutting it again. You actually do a ritual around it. So you would actually wash the body and rewrap it and then put it back into the grave. But again, because what you're doing is you're looking for certain symptoms. And these symptoms typically revolve around being very pale, go figure. It can be very pale if they're, if you think that you've seen one, I should say that. But if you open up the casket, if they're reddish or bluish looking or purplish, that means they've recently feasted on blood. So that's one thing that you have to look out for. You also have to look out for if the corpse is bloated, which most corpses, if anybody's watched CSI recently, tend to do that, right? And there's a variety of reasons that we think that people believed in vampires. And typically, when you would get really nervous, if there were a lot of deaths, unexplained deaths around your village, if somebody died, and again, this goes to that traditional peasant culture, that tight-knit, clan-based village. If you died alone, outside of the gaze of your community, there was always a suspicion that that's what could have caused it, that it lured you away somehow, right? And out of safety of your village, and outside of those walls, that embrace of your clan, you died by yourself. So it's very, very suspicious. So there's certain things that will actually tip them off. Another thing that Roma believe, foods. So think about this one for Halloween. There's a reason you carve pumpkins and gourds, because there are some foods that can become mulo. And those are anything that can look kind of human-esque, human body shaped, like a gourd, or like a head, right? Some kind of pumpkin. So any kind of gourd like that there is a possibility that it can do it as. One, think about it. You've got it. I mean, everybody's seen something creepy like this once in their life. You've got an old gourd or an old pumpkin sitting out on your porch for 2 months after Halloween because you're far too lazy to walk it back to the compost pile. And it suddenly starts moving a little bit, right? Everybody's seen this, at least in their trash cans. Full of maggots, right? But it's going to move. So you can see why people would start coming up with some of these ideas. These are things to be very cautious about. Heck, I'm cautious about it, and I don't even think vampire, right? That's the point that I yell for my husband to go take out the trash. Hi, honey. So there are a couple of things that you can do if you know that an animal sat on your spouse. Right? If you know that there was something that happened, maybe this person wasn't a good person in life, maybe they didn't do all the rituals they were supposed to do, and you know that there's a possibility they could become a strigoi, there's a few things that you can do. For instance, you can pierce the body. And what they would do in Southeast Europe is they would pierce the body with pieces of iron. So you could do, or little pins. If you're wealthier, right, the pins you would use for sewing. But typically what it was little tiny iron rods. And you would pierce the eyes shut and the mouth shut. And then you would drive it into the heart. Right? So you can see where some of these ideas are starting to come from. You can also use you can use a piece of a rose bush, or you can use hawthorn. If you want to use some kind of wood and you're not wealthy enough to afford all these little iron bits, you can use that to pierce the heart as well, and to make little slivers. To pierce the eyes and the mouth. And so there we get our stakes. Right? You can also, if you want to protect yourself, because the first people that strigoi go for are family members, because that's who you know. It's your family, it's your clan. So if you know that maybe the person wasn't the best person, maybe they didn't do the things they were supposed to do, maybe they did, get jumped over by that cat, then what you can do is you can bury a bottle of wine about a foot from the grave. And then after about 2 or 3 months, which you better hope that they didn't wake up in the meantime, you can actually pull that bottle out and drink it. Right? Another liquid of life, right? You pass it around, it's been buried in that sacred ground. And of course, I should also say too, there's a reason that you consecrate ground. And that consecrated ground is so important. It's supposed to protect bodies from things. One of the things that consecrated ground does, why a priest blesses a graveyard, is because vampires don't like consecrated ground. Since there's something unnatural, thus unholy, later on when we talk about Christianity, then that means that vampires, for one thing, are going to shy away from it. So if you ever get chased, just to let you know, ever get chased by a vampire, always run to a cemetery or a church. Consecrated ground. Another thing that you can do as well, you can put salt, basically seed the earth around the gravesite with salt. Because yet again, in peasant culture, this is another sign of life. And so their idea was, any wedding that you go to in East Europe in a peasant village, typically the bride and groom's father are going to walk up to the new couple, and they're actually going to present them with a loaf of bread and some salt, right? And so this goes into the traditions that they're supposed to live into, and therefore, if you sow this ground with it, then therefore you can protect yourself. You can also do things like you can walk around with burning hemp, or any kind, burning hawthorn at times, again to kind of clean the air around that grave. You can pour boiling water, or you can also set fire to the top of this grave, right? Just pile some wood on top of it. So that gets us to another one of the myths about vampires, right? In Western, American tradition that we'll see in a few minutes. So I also wanted to talk as well about the mass panic in Austria in the 18th century. What happens is that you have two major cases, both in Serbia, where there are all these rumors That, for instance, Peter Plagojevich, the story about him was that he showed up, he had been very hungry, and he told his son that he wanted his son to feed him. Now think about this, the son's got to be really worried because he decided not to feed his father, and that's something that you're supposed to do in a peasant culture. Your parent asks you for food, you need to make sure they're fed. Well, the next day they discover the father's body. And then about a week later, suddenly all these deaths start happening in neighboring villages. And it causes this mass panic, and they go to patient zero, and patient zero seemed to be Peter. Arnold Palais, a similar case. He actually was discovered, outside of his village. He was, I believe he was cutting hay that day, and nobody saw him, and they finally found his body. And again, all of these deaths, this mysterious deaths, started happening in neighboring villages, and there's mass panic. So much mass panic, if you know anything about your European history, even Voltaire is commenting on it. You have very famous members of the church going to analyze these cases and to talk about what's happening in the Austrian countryside. This hysteria spreads. It's one whole generation. It spreads all over the Austrian Empire. And what ends up happening, Maria Theresa, the empress at the time, this big empire, was getting fed up. I mean, this is causing mass hysteria. It's ruining social order. She ends up having to send her personal physician to go and analyze all of the graves in the region and to come up with a rational explanation about what's happening there because so many villages were affected by this. So many people were panicking. And think about this. We just had Gillian Hendershot talk about witches the other day. With witches, you can point to somebody, right? And you can say, that person is a witch. You can't do it with vampires. You can go and open up, and that's what they're doing during this hysteria. They're going into cemeteries. They're digging up graves, and they're opening up any casket they can find to try to find those symptoms, that bloated body, the reddish, bluish look. And they can't find it. But you can't point to somebody. You could say, I bet that person might become one. I don't like him so much, right? He doesn't do what he's supposed to do. But they don't walk among you during the day. So you've got to actually dig them up to find them if you were looking during the day. And at night, you don't go out, right? They're going to overpower you. One of the ideas about vampires that come out of East Europe is they can change into animals. You're never actually going to be able to find them. If you actually think you see one, it can change into an animal and get away from you. And they supposedly have these powers, right? They're stronger than you. They're faster than you. So you've got to find them during the day. And they can't find. They dig up these two bodies, and that's the reason they get blamed for it. They find these symptoms in these bodies. But even when they drive the hawthorn through their hearts, they set the bodies on fire, this doesn't end. So she sends her personal physician. He comes up with explanations about the deaths that are happening in other villages. But the Austrian Empire actually has to make laws within the empire itself that people are not allowed to go into cemeteries and open up these crypts anymore and the coffins. And they're not allowed to set bodies on fire. So they actually end up having to implement rules about desecration of bodies because of a vampire scare in the Austrian Empire. But it got completely out of control during this period. So this fear is real. And of course, all of these, and Enlightenment scholars, they like to write. And they like to publish everything that they put out. Right? So then everybody likes to read what the Enlightenment scholars. So Voltaire's getting involved in this. A variety of other people are writing their responses to this. Right? Which means people in Germany, right? People in the German Confederation, people in England, people in parts of France, they're all reading this stuff, right? Which means the legend coming from East Europe is starting to spread into these countries. This is one of the images from the 1700s about vampires. And again, you see, what are they doing? Eating babies, right? They've caused mass panic. Look, the one kid back here is like, Mom, he's eating a baby. And the mom's like, we got to go inside. That one's lost, right? I'm glad my class is here because they get my really just dank, dark sense of humor about this stuff. I do not condone the eating of babies. I would just like to say that out loud now so that nobody tries to accuse me of it later. But look, somebody's head's ripped off, right? Just sitting out there willy-nilly. But this is to them, I mean, this is a real fear. This is supposedly what people are seeing, right, when they come out of their houses. This is a little bit later. This is somebody commenting about this period of time. It's a woodcut where supposedly the Austrian, we don't actually have any sources that say Austrian soldiers came in and opened up graves and impaled the contents of said grave. But the villagers definitely were doing so during this period. So let's talk about the 19th century. Now, to set this up for you, now, as I said, these ideas have started to spread. They don't go away in the countryside. I mean, legally, you're not allowed to do any of the rituals, which, imagine how much that freaks you out. If you live in the Austrian Empire, you are no longer allowed to do the rituals that protect you from these things. You can't open up that grave anymore. You can't drive that stake through their heart. Imagine the panic that causes, particularly in the village, right? Particularly when you do have people who aren't living up to the roles that they're expected to live up to in society and in, gender-wise in general. But let's talk about the 19th century, and just to set it up for you a little bit. The Victorian culture is not nearly as repressed as people used to say it was. It used to be that there was always this image presented of the 19th century, particularly in England, that they're anti-sex, that they're extraordinarily conservative, that they, and there are those lines that you can draw about Victorian society. But one of the things you got to say about the Victorians, and this is a lot of the new works that have come out, they are obsessed with sex. And they're also obsessed with death. Now, there's another thing that plays into the story in the background, a couple of other things that play into the story. Our first story that we see published in England is called The Vampire. It's by Polidori. This is I forget what year it's published. I meant to put that up there, but it's very, very early. And what it does, he's a friend of Lord Byron. Now, who's heard of Lord Byron? Who's seen a picture of Lord Byron before? How would you describe Lord Byron? Very handsome. Anything else? Hot. He definitely was hot. I have no problem admitting that. Huh? Striking. How'd he dress?
Flamboyant.
Very flamboyantly, very fashionably, height of fashion, very pale. He had hair that was curled just so. And anytime you see a picture of him, he's staring off into the distance, thinking about his soul, right? Which is very, very different than the Enlightenment man. See, for those of you, and I know there's some historians in the room, and I know there are people who have taken history classes. When you think about the Enlightenment, what are words you think of? Reason. Science.
Clockwork universe.
What?
Clockwork universe.
Yeah. And I heard something else over here. Equality. Ration. Not Byron, right? Byron's emotion. Byron's living in your soul. Byron's not really caring what the rest of society. He gets kicked out of England, right? He has an affair with his first cousin. He doesn't care what you think, you little piddly people think about him, right? He has to go out and have fun and think about heart and think about, how he doesn't care what you think about him, right? Polidori was a very good friend of his. And the story behind The Vampire, which becomes a lot of people read it. It's not a smash hit like Bram Stoker's book's going to be, right? But it all comes about, they all get totally stoned one night. He and Byron and a couple of ladies they were hanging out with, including the writer of Frankenstein, who's Mary Shelley, right? And her husband, Percy Bysshe Shelley. So they're all hanging out. This nice villa, because that's what you do when you're related to the nobility. You don't have to have a job, right? You get your opium, you smoke a lot of it, you drink a lot, and then you tell each other stories. And the vampire, Frankenstein, came out of this extended stay in the countryside. And so did the vampire, which tells you You don't want to mix alcohol and opium and then talk to Byron, which is, because the nightmare stories that come out of this weekend holiday it doesn't sound like a good holiday to me, right? But the vampire kind of sets up, this is one of the first stories that we see, it starts to set up that mythology that we accept about the vampire, that they're a pale figure, they're very skinny, but they're tortured, right? Which comes into the Byron. That it's a tortured poetic soul. They didn't mean to do the things that they did. They were just trying to lead a good life, right? And something horrible happened to them. They were bit. They didn't expect it to happen. And now they have to lead this anti-hero existence, right? Because there's one reason we think about vampires, we've seen vampire movies, is because we're attracted to them because of the fact it's very rare that the vampire is the true bad guy in the movie. I mean, a lot of the times you kind of root for them a little bit. The same in the books, right? Because they have this tortured past. Now, the peasants in Romania would say, absolutely not. This is not how this works out, folks. You are supposed to feel bad about the things that you did, and this is a punishment. The Greeks, the same thing, right? The Mesopotamians, the same thing. But for them, it creates this very romantic image. It's a rejection of that enlightenment, ration, and reason. So part of this is a new construct of masculinity that comes into this. It's coming into vogue in the early 19th century. The flamboyant character, the pale, retiring character, the one who thinks about his emotions. I mean, there's a reason this whole cultural movement is called Romanticism, right? That doesn't mean the other characters go away, the other type of masculinity, but there's a new version. And so this gets played out in things like the vampire. Now things get a little bit interesting with Varney, which is a great name, right? Oh, here's some people just opening up coffins. So this is actually from the 19th century. So they're still fixated on this moment in Austria, right? And this is a direct response to this. And they're trying to make sure it's dead. So what they've done is they've opened up the casket, they've cut the body apart, and now they're stabbing it with a stake and at the same time setting it on fire. Because you need to be careful and sure, right? You can't overdo it when it comes to a vampire. This is Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood. Varney the Vampire was a dime novel. What it is what in the 1840s, you could print these, what are they called? Now my brain's not working. But this wasn't a penny dreadful initially. They end up reprinting it as that. What you would do is the authors would get paid by the chapter in certain situations, and they would print them out in newspapers in town. And it depends on what newspaper you're talking about, but about once every week to every month, they'll come out with a new installment. And the idea it wasn't anything about cultural literacy or giving you something to enjoy. The better the story, the more fantastical the story, of course, and the more sexy the story, the more that those Victorians who are obsessed with sex and death, so there you go right there, they're going to go and read it, right? And so the more of those themes you have in a story, the more people who are going to buy it, which more people supporting your newspaper. This ends up being, I think it was something like 295 installments. It's really long. And the best part about Gothic, and this is part of the whole Gothic genre, the best part about any kind of Gothic romance or Gothic novel in general, the most horrendous things happen to these people. Varney, there's at least 20 attempted rapes of the main character. This vampire's constantly chasing her around. Then there's ghosts. And I believe a werewolf shows up at one part. But the whole story is kind of building on that vampire legend that Polidori is establishing in England. And again, as you see, with this image, there's another change. If you think about Lilith, right? If you think about Lamashtu, if you think about the Striges, suddenly we have the woman being the victim. Now, they weren't part of the story, right? But they were also the aggressors in ancient society. Suddenly, one of the interesting things about Victorian society is particularly middle-class society in Victorian England, is they really focus on this need to protect women. That middle-class women are supposed to remain in the home. They're supposed to be educating children. They are most definitely not supposed to have jobs. So part of the interesting section of Gothic novels is that when the woman steps out to have an adventure, these horrendous things happen. She ends up in a haunted house. She's kidnapped. She's almost raped. She'll end up getting involved with a rake. A rake is a really lascivious person at court. Right? He'll try to seduce her. Her virtue will allow her to run away from the person. There's always a hero, the White Knight, who's going to help her. Now, sometimes she'll be able to pull herself out of this mess. But the end story is supposed to be that she's supposed to be happy, she's supposed to be in love, and she's supposed to get married and go have babies, and she'll be safe, right? She had her adventure. Now she's supposed to go be safe in the home. And so one of the interesting things that we see coming out of the 19th century is you don't really have female vampires that are the aggressors anymore. It's going to be focused on men. And it's also going to be focused on that concept of the anti-hero. Where was I? Oh, so I said before, part of the obsession in Victorian society was also this, the idea of death. The Victorians were obsessed with death, so much that they're really, really worried that they could be buried alive. And this comes into the vampire myth, right? It's one of these scientific ideas that really freaked the Victorians out because people are trying to be rational. Well, what makes a vampire? Well, it might be rabies, it might be a wasting sickness, or it could be that the person was buried alive and nobody caught it. And so, they scratched on the coffin and they caused some dirt to displace. And then they dig them up later and the grave looks disturbed and voila, you have a vampire. The Victorians did not like this. So they actually had, and this wasn't widespread. There are plenty of, I should say, preface this, there are plenty of rational people in 19th century England. But there was this whole subsection of people who are obsessed with this idea of the vampire. They're obsessed with this idea of what the vampire represents. They're obsessed with that idea that you could actually be buried alive. And so they actually have one of the things that you could buy for your coffin was a little tube that was attached to your coffin that had a flag. And if you were ever buried alive, you could pull that lever and the flag would raise above your grave to let your family, who's supposed to be nice, right? They're supposed to be coming by and mourning, that would freak me out if that flag went up, right? Because then what do you do, right? If you inherited something really nice, like a castle or something, you just put that flag right back down again. And I said that out loud, didn't I? Anyway, so, but that tells you something. There are these little inventions. That tells you something about that fear that's underlying a lot of this. So you can say, particularly with the publication of Bram Stoker's Dracula, this by far best-selling vampire novel, 1892. An Irishman named Bram Stoker writes this book. It goes along with the general, and this is really what's going to set up and solidify our ideas about what a vampire is, how you can kill it. They're always in East European history, East European peasant culture. There's always these ideas. Maybe there are little things that can protect you, but you can't afford something really expensive like a very specially made amulet, right? So coins, putting a coin in the mouth of the deceased. Holy water, very easy to obtain. Garlic. Anybody who's eaten a meal in East Europe or an East European food knows, heavy on the garlic, right? So little things like that an average peasant could afford, those can be used as amulets, and that's going to get transferred over to Bram Stoker's Dracula. The same thing with the idea that you can, the first thing you have to do, you open up the coffin, you check the body, you know what to look for. They don't go out during the day, they're only around at night. You can impale the person through the heart, and you can also kill them by setting them on fire. Right? But they have all these special powers. That's all going to get set up in Bram Stoker's Dracula. Now, I want to make a point. There you have yet another overly sexualized image. This is Succubus by Burne-Jones in 1897. And that's another, we're going to get to the female as getting a little bit more aggressive in the 1920s. This is a vampire killer kit. And you think I'm making this up, right? But they actually sold these things. Because if you get really worried, or say you want a second job, right? You can actually protect your home and family. You have your holy water, you have your stakes, you have a gun with silver bullets, you have a silver knife, you have a stake. This is like your cure-all stake right here. It's the stake with silver on it and a cross on it too. right? So at the Bible, another crucifix. I guess that one you just throw at them, as you run away. So you have, these kids, this kit went for $15,000, I should say, on eBay. So go look at your grandparents' house. You never know. That would freak me out if I found it at my grandparents' house, though. But this says something, that you have professional vampire hunters. Van Helsing in Dracula, the professional vampire hunter in the books. Right? Let me get back to that in just a second. One of the things I also want to talk about with Bram Stoker's Dracula, one of the important things to think about is that it's not just about gender and sexuality and some of these things. I'm going to get back to those images to play on some other things I want to talk about. One of the things that, if you know your Dracula, Mina, Lucy, two women in the novel, the two main female characters in the novel, they're people who have to be protected from men, particularly from Count Dracula. Because Dracula is out to seduce them. He thinks that Mina is the reincarnation of his first wife. He thinks that he's actually using Lucy to get to her. He has this seductive power where he can look into your eyes. He can mesmerize you. And so there is this issue about, look what happens. If you let women out of the home, they get themselves in danger, right? By men who are foreign. There are a lot of elements in Bram Stoker's Dracula that correspond directly to perceptions about Jews in particular. The other thing that you see, 1897 in England, there's a paranoia in particular about East Europeans. There's a mass migration going on at that point through England to the United States. There's a paranoia about anybody foreign, particularly foreign men. There's an idea that there are too many Jews coming in, and the stereotypical characteristics that people in England were saying all Jews had, they're fitting in to Count Dracula. And think about it, vampirism is like a disease, right? He just keeps biting people. People keep getting sick. The ship that he's on, everybody dies on it, right? The only thing that's left are rats. And so there's an idea here, this mysterious count is traveling around Europe. He brings this disease, people die, and then on top of that, he's a threat to your women, right? Because women are the most susceptible to his wiles and his whims. I have to bring up poor Vlad Tepes, which really isn't a poor Vlad Tepes because he was kind of mean, but the person that Bram Stoker focuses on when he starts to write the character of Count Dracula is this guy. And this guy is a 15th century prince from Romania. He was also known as Vlad the Impaler because he did, yes, like to impale people, right? This is a great woodcut of it. He was kind of a Machiavellian leader. What he would, he saw himself as a Christian prince who was trying to keep out the Ottomans, but he was also trying to centralize his power in Romania. So as you see, he's sitting there at a dinner table and watching people be impaled in front of him. What he would do is, yes, invite you and your entire extended clan to dinner. He would make you explain why you were causing uprisings in his area, and then he would inform his soldiers to impale those people on these spikes, and then he'd leave about 2 people, 3 people alive and send them back to their stronghold to inform everybody else what he did to them. Right? Now this is interesting because he's used as this setup, right, for this count that brings in this idea that the Carpathians, this is where all of this kind of backwardsness is. This is an old idea from the early 1700s. In Western Europe, that East Europe is very backwards. You can just look at their peasant culture and their traditions, and it's so backwards that all of these people coming to England, all of these aliens, right? They're bringing this disease, they're these horrible people, they're threatening your women, and then look at what the ultimate, look at their nature, right? I mean, that's how he's using Vlad Tepes, which is interesting because if you ever ask a Romanian about Vlad Tepes, they will tell you that he was the protector of Christianity and he managed to keep the Ottomans from pushing into northern Romania in particular. This is a Romanian postage stamp. If you want to talk about the period of national communism, Nicolae Ceausescu in Romania held up Vlad Tepes as one of the Romanian heroes. And so, which is, if you knew a lot about Ceausescu, it's not that shocking that he decided that a guy who impaled people for fun and profit was a national hero. But it does tell you so. You know, one of the things when I was living in Romania, anytime that I would ask somebody, or I would never ask somebody about, I knew better than to ask them about vampires. But you'd occasionally get, you know, a new American on board. In particular, somebody from England who wanted to talk about Bram Stoker, and the Romanians were always like, "Dearest, this vampire, it is a lie, you know. So they're very, very sensitive about this idea, and you know, that this is, in their minds, this is somebody from the West coming and stealing their culture and making it this horrific, horrific example. But I should say the thing that he really actually focused on, Bram Stoker never went to East Europe. What he did do is go to the church down the street from his house, and that church happens to have mummies in the basement of it, one of whom is this really tall crusader that they actually had to cut in half to fit him in his coffin. And so this is where he really got a lot of his ideas, right, hanging out in Ireland. But let me move on because I don't have much time left. I did want to get onto film, and then I want to get into the big film that I want to talk about by the end here. There are a couple of films, and this, of course, you have Bram Stoker's book. A lot of people read this book. But if you want to think about the kind of cross-pollination of this myth and why this myth is still around and why is it so important, there are a couple of films that come out. In 1922, you have Nosferatu. Come out. I don't have time to show the clip at this point, but because I want to leave time for question and answer. But I would highly recommend, as you see, YouTube, right, has plenty of clips from Nosferatu. And this is a very famous film. You can also rent it as well. But we do see that they actually got sued. It's Dracula, the whole story of Dracula, Nosferatu. They just changed his name to Count Orloff because they couldn't get Bram Stoker's widow to sell them the rights to the movie, so they ended up getting sued. But it's actually a beautiful film, and I highly recommend it. This is one of the movie posters from it, right? Back in the day when movie posters were art, this is the guy, right? This is what Count Dracula is supposed to look like. I would like you to compare this to Edward Cullen in a couple of minutes, right? I like that you get my Twilight jokes. I want to say, too, you saw those images that I flipped through really quickly. Those lascivious women that I was showing the pictures of in 1897. Edward Munch, he actually named this something like The Embrace. But the viewers actually renamed this image The Vampire. So it doesn't actually go by the name that he gave it. It goes by the name that everybody else gave it. And here you have a predatory woman, right, nibbling on the guy's neck. Same thing with this image, right? This is a succubus having sex with a man, obviously getting this sexual gratification out of this moment. Which gets us back, I hope I'm not making anybody nauseous with my clicking, right? This lady. Anybody heard the term vamp before? Somebody acting vampy? It's also a nail polish, which is quite pretty. Wow, yeah, I need more coffee. So this is Theda Bara. Her first name's spelled Theda. Theda Bara was billed as the woman from the Nile. The ultimate, what they called the vamp. Now, going back to those images we were just looking at, what happens if you want to think about gender and sexuality? There's this obsession in the 1920s and 1930s with what's called the new woman. And the new woman wears short skirts, and she dances the Charleston, which means you kick up your legs a little bit. I'm not going to do it for you, but you know, whatever. You get the general gist. But your skirt would flip up a little bit when you did it, and you dance really close to men, where your body parts might be touching occasionally. You actually go outside your home. Now think about that middle class idea. Suddenly you go outside your home and you can actually get a job in the city as a young woman. And you don't have to live with your parents. If you live in the city, you can actually get your own apartment with your friends. Therefore, you're not under patriarchal authority anymore. And one of the things we start to see 1910, 1920, 1930 is this obsession with this sexualization of women, as you just saw in those paintings, and as you see in this term, the vamp, right? The vamp character, the woman who's so lascivious, who's so sexualized, she's going to exhaust you. She's a succubus. Theda Bare was also known as Jutel. You can't really see it in this costume, but she wears nothing in her films. She basically has these garments that are completely sheer, and they have pasties on them, and like some glitter right here, right? And you think, I always tell my students, like, you think that, people complain about how people dress nowadays, but man, some of these 1920s movie stars and 1930s movie stars, you'd be shocked at what they wear. Now, of course, the most famous film, but that's also part of this response to this obsession with the new woman, this idea again that you need to protect these women. And again, you should watch. I don't have time. Sorry, I don't have time to show it. But you should watch this movie trailer because it's the old 1930s movie trailer, and it's a lot of fun to actually sit and watch for a minute or so. But to push this old idea again, and to also, like I said before, it's not just about gender and sexuality, it's also about identity and what's really worrying the society in general at the time. You're talking about a movie that's made at the worst years of the Depression, right? Where people feel this pressure, they feel like there's something unseen that's threatening their lives. So this was a perfect time, and they actually got the film rights, so these guys didn't get sued. Bela Lugosi, he ends up getting just to give you a movie myth, he actually ends up getting typecast. If you want to think about, male leads in Hollywood, gets typecast out of this movie. He can't really get many jobs after this. He ends up becoming the first celebrity to go through rehab in public for his addiction to opiates. Right? Just a little aside for you. Here he is. The man himself. He gets into this big spat with Boris Karloff, too. Boris Karloff always plays the werewolves in movies, and he also plays Frankenstein. And Bela Lugosi only got the Dracula character. And so they had this big rivalry going about who was going to get the next supernatural character. But usually it was Karloff. Now, to give you a sense about how popular this is and why it is we still talk about Dracula and the Dracula legend, of course, from this point on, you're going to have a revitalization of the Dracula franchise in the 1970s with Christopher Lee. You'll have 1990s, Francis Ford Coppola, right, does another one. I'm sure we're due for one any minute now, right? My favorite, House of Dracula. It has the Hunchback, the Mad Dr. Dracula, Wolfman, Frankenstein's monster. It's got everything you need in one movie, right? But again, in these films, and if you want to think about the combination between gender and ethnicity and all of these things, the most attended blaxploitation film in American history was this one. And so then you see that part of the way that you can use the vampire to express yourself and to express your troubles about society is by taking on that form, right? And using it in something like a blaxploitation film, which is brilliant, by the way, and I recommend to all of you. Now, very quickly so that I can get to where I need to go. What?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh.
Maybe the vampire was like best movie ever.
Oh, man. Did you read the book?
No, I think that's like the best vampire movie ever.
Go with the book.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, well, thanks.
Anne Rice, the interesting thing about Anne Rice, and this is going to get us into Buffy and some other issues before I get into the big movie that I wanted to talk about. We do see a shift. When society does start to have discussions, particularly about homosexuality, out in the open after Stonewall, after the Stonewall riots, right, where you have a very political and active gay community, this is the point that you do start to see, just like we talked about with Blackula, right? A community who takes, really kind of takes these characters and embraces them and embraces this movement itself. And Anne Rice is a great example of that. For the first time ever, we don't just have a Byronic character that challenges concepts of masculinity. Lestat and Louis have a relationship together. Lestat makes Louis the vampire, right? They live together for years. There's this sexual tension between them and other vampires. It's a very ambiguous at times in Anne Rice novels, but for the most part, it is an exploration, a study of sexuality, and a rejection of the norms, right, sexual norms that have been espoused for hundreds of years at this point. And the other interesting thing, as you see up there in the Queen of the Damned, we finally have a strong female character. She ends up getting killed. But of course, we always get punished, right? End up being baby eaters and whatever mythology that happens. One of the big, it's interesting, Anne Rice is very, very open about men and about homosexuality, about bisexuality. But when it comes to women, the villain of the Queen of the Damned, a kind of an anti-heroine of Queen of the Damned, wants to get rid of all men, or at least most men, and create a government of women, right? And thus she is punished for it by Lestat in the long run and other vampires. So just these things don't go away. Right? My favorite. Very quickly about Buffy. The cool thing about Buffy is Buffy was written by a feminist, Joss Whedon, who I would worship at the altar of Joss Whedon if it only was a true church. These are the cast of characters. What's really cool about Joss Whedon is he creates a very strong female character in Buffy. And that hadn't been seen a lot on television up to this point. There's a reason that the academic community in general loved this show. And it's because particularly how well he wrote her. And of course she, her job is to kill these vampires. Now you still have these Byronic conceptions, right, of the vampire. The, Angel, the vampire who has his soul back again, right? Spike, who really doesn't care whether he has a soul or not, but he's awesome nonetheless, right? I have a certain amount of affection for Spike, more so than Angel, but we all have to take our sides in life. What I want to talk about, though, what's really cool about the Buffy phenomenon, thinking about gender and sexuality. Anybody know what fan fiction is? A few people. So fan fiction is when a fan decides to take a television show, something like Buffy, right? It starts off with Doctor Who, and then Highlander after that, and then it expands from there. And the cool thing about fan fiction is when you don't like where two characters in a show go, right? You didn't want Jim and Pam to get married last week on The Office, say. Somebody was shocked that I said that out loud. So you can write a story that says it never happened. Alternately, if there's a character that you think is gay on a show, you can write about a relationship that character has. Fan fiction becomes a way, particularly, and we really see this in what we call the Buffyverse, right? All of these things, this multimedia that surrounds Buffy the Vampire Slayer in general. Fans particularly took this moment, even though Whedon in particular, he has a lesbian relationship on his show between a character named Tara and Willow. And it's fantastically written because it's not for titillation. It's a normal relationship between two people. Their first kiss actually happens off screen. They talk about it, right? It's not for the audience to view. It's just part of life, which is one of the reasons that people are so affectionate about Whedon. The other thing that's interesting about this, like I said, you can write your own story. On fanfiction.net, right? I'll give them a shout out. That if you don't like what happens, or if you don't, if you love the show, but you want to feel something real for it, you want it to express your desire, you want it to express how you see the world, you can write it for yourself. You just use those characters. You're using that Play-Doh, right? And creating what you want out of it. And that's one of the cool things that we see in particular coming from this particular genre. I mean, the amount of stories that if you go on fan fiction for Buffy that are called slash, right? So in other words, that you create homosexual characters from the main characters. It's phenomenal how many there are. And so what's really interesting is this becomes a community idea that if you look at this fan fiction, and people do for Buffy, there are academic conferences about it, looking at this and talking about what society wants and needs and desires, right? Which is very, very different than what society says that it needs and wants and desires in the popular press. I just had to show you the front covers of these, but we don't have time for these. But again, I want to get to this instead of paranormal, because this is kind of paranormal romance anyway. So, how many of you have read Twilight? Don't lie. How many of you saw the movie? I know half of you are lying right now. Like half the men in the audience are like, I know you did. I was in line with you. So I got to say something about Twilight. I know a lot of people are big fans of Twilight, and you are not allowed to follow me out to my car after this and beat me up. It is the most craptastically written series in the history of literature. Thank you. Try the veal. So the reason that I say that, A, is because Stephanie Meyers is a horrible writer. Hopefully we can cut that out later. In my opinion, and not the opinion of GRCC. This is a story. Let me just set it up for you guys who won't admit to reading it. This is a story about a young woman named Bella Swan. And I have my picture, which tells you all you need to know about this relationship. So she meets this dreamy boy, and that's what's so cute about these books. It's that moment, if you can go back to 5th grade, and you can be like, sitting at the lunch table, oh my God, he's so dreamy. That's this book, right? What's wrong with him? Does he have acne? He's a vampire. He's so dreamy. So he might kill me, but I love him anyway. So the whole story is about Bella Swan, and she meets this dreamy boy who happens to also be a Sparklepire. This is where I get this word, and it's an internet word, and you can look it up on Urban Dictionary, because it is there. So he seems very, aloof, but well-dressed and well-coiffed, right? Which is our Byronic vampire, yet again. He's 104 years old. She finally figures out, slowly but surely, through just the most ridiculous 20 minutes of a movie I've ever seen, where she's like, wow, he's really cold. He must be a vampire. I'll go look it up on the internet and Google it and look on Wikipedia. And so the weird part is, and the reason that I have such an exception with these books, they're written for young adults. And the story that they set up is that you don't have to have a personality as a woman. You don't have to have any goals in your life. Her whole goal, after she meets this guy and figures out he's a vampire, is to die and be like him. She stops talking to her friends. She stops doing anything with her family. She has no interests of her own. It is all about him. And I gotta say, this is one of the most mentally abusive relationships in history. She has a friend who happens to be a werewolf. Sometimes when I say this stuff in an academic conference, I'm like, I can't believe I just said that out loud. She has a friend who's a werewolf. And she, part of the interesting thing about this relationship is that, she likes this other boy. They're good friends. So he actually pulls, I think it was her battery cables, out of her truck so she can't visit her friend because he has to protect her, which gets us back to those Victorian ideals, right? She's somebody who has to be protected. He even has to protect her from himself. He could kill her, right? She is this overly horny teenage girl in these stories. She always wants to make out with him, right? And he's always like, no, I must protect you from myself. So suddenly, it's not just about physically protecting these women from a vampire. You actually have to protect a teenage girl from her own hormones. That's your responsibility as a man. And that's why I have so many issues, right, with this series. Because as the series goes on, this gets worse and worse and worse. She whines for the next 2 books about wanting to die, right, and be like him. And this is what young women are reading. 70 million copies sold, right? Exactly. And let me tell you a secret, because I'm going to spoil it all, because I know now you're like, I have to go see it. It sounds so brilliant. The reason I call them Sparklepires is everybody always messes with this vampire genre, right? Especially if you don't have a lot of money for production or you've just completely lost all your creativity. You try to figure out ways for vampires to hang out with the ladies during the day. And the way that they do this, the reason he can't go out in bright sunlight, but he can go out in dim sunlight, is because when sunlight hits him, he sparkles. That's right, folks. So there's this great scene in the movie, and I tried to find the clip of it, but he actually runs, and she's like, I love you, let's make out. And he says, no, I'm too dangerous for you. So he gets in the sunlight, and he rips his shirt open, and he says, and the sun comes down, and he starts glittering. And he says, This is the skin of a killer. Which gets us into the metrosexuality part of all this, right? Very well coined. This Byronic character, right? He's the perfect boy in his Wayfarer sunglasses. And on top of everything else, he uses a lot of product and he sparkles. And I want to, thinking back to the Lilith, right? The Garden of Eden. This is the first book. Now, is the cover of the first book. Now, Stephanie Meyer says she picked this cover in particular, right? Because it's their forbidden love, right? Now, what does that apple represent? The falling of Eve, right? Sin. And what's he protecting her from? Himself, right? And from her sinning with him. Those are the, creepier things that come out of this. And so I left like no time because I totally thought I was going to go, like I had nothing and I'd go for 20 minutes today, and I just kept rambling. And making my jokes about Twilight. So I think I should end there, but I should just, kind of throw it out there and say, if we think about how this tells us something about concepts of gender and sexuality, there are other shows out right now, True Blood, right? Which is a modern story about the gay rights movement. There are things out there that rebut this, but 70 million books sold. What does this say about our concepts of gender and sexuality that we're trying to put out there, right, in the popular press right now? Who's got questions?
I just wondered about the succubi and the incubi thing. Was the incubi, is that like where the English word for incubate came? Because basically its function is what you said, right?
I don't know. I honestly don't know if it's drawn from the same lines. Or
Well, that's pretty much what it does, though, right? Is incubate? The
Yeah.
incubi? All right, cool.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, I had thought about that. Maybe. Now remember, no following me to my car and trying to beat me up. I'm little, but I'm mean.
I was going to mention at Hot Topic, they sell sparkle dust for guys.
Oh,
Because of
all
the
men
Twilight
are
book.
laughing, but they're like, I know where I'm going right now.
Straight on. Well, I just wanted to make a comment about the painting that was originally entitled Embrace. I'm currently in a women's studies class, and I've just, been thinking about that sort of thing. Where isn't it more ambiguous, and that it just showed the society's fear of women that were sort of supportive of men, rather men supporting the women.
I mean, I would actually say that, one of the critiques about that painting in general is the reason that people rename it, that he doesn't rename it, the viewers rename it, is because it's not about what he intended. It's
Right.
about how they viewed it.
Right.
And how they viewed it was obvious that women prey, right, on men. And that comes out of these new concepts of feminism and everything else that are changing during that period.
Right.
Any other questions?
I'm just curious, does Elizabeth Bathory fit into this whole history of, even though she technically wasn't a vampire? How do you feel about her fitting into? I mean, did you just leave her off the list? I don't know.
You know what's interesting? If you talk about the same period with that piece of art that we were just talking about, Elizabeth Bathory becomes part of the story again. Elizabeth Bathory was known as this woman who would slaughter. From the region of the Austrian Empire, she would or Bohemia. She's from Bohemia. She would slaughter young women, and then she would bathe in their blood, right? And this actually is a documented case. It did happen. She's a female serial killer, basically. And that story, it's a good question because that story actually becomes more and more important in that period where people start to fear women more and more and women's power more and more. And so suddenly you start to see that story in particular get repeated, right? As this cautionary tale about what women are capable of, right? Vanity, I mean, that's why she's bathing in blood. That's who women are in the Bathory story in particular.
So can we make it a general principle that when women appear to be more liberated, there's the reappearance of the male vampire at that point as the person to keep them in line? Or is that something that is intermittent, or is that more a modern phenomenon?
I mean, I would say, you know, even if you watch, does anybody watch True Blood? Some people do. Are there any strong female vampire characters on True Blood that you're not expecting to die sometime very quickly? One of the interesting parts of this whole story is the fact that, you know, we start off with these really strong female vampires, and then by the end, it's always men, right? If they are a female character, they're either in the background of the story, and they're not really an important main character, or they're a character that dies off. It's sort of some kind of moral purpose in the story. And so I would actually say that, you know, the emergence of the male vampire, I mean, the one we're still working with, Edward Cullen, is the same vampire that Polidori, except for the whole sparkling part, that Polidori was working with, right? And so what we have to do is shift out of those stories and actually have, I don't know, what'll tell me something is when you actually have a vampire movie that celebrates a powerful female vampire, a TV show. Huh? There's a video that they do that. It's awesome. Any other questions?
One more?
Anybody I don't get to, you can come up and ask me your question afterwards. It's totally fine.
I just have a comment and a question as well. When David Cope was just talking about does the vampire reappear to kill off these women, I recently took a women's literature course, and that's actually a very, very old thing that like we are introduced like to these strong, independent women characters, and then at the end they die somehow, and then literature kind of progresses from there, and we actually have them living, have happy endings, but now we're kind of back to them dying. So I think that's a very interesting and important point that you brought up. Also, I had a couple of questions, but I'm going to try to cut it short. I was wondering with the Strigoi, is that correct?
I'm sorry?
I was wondering about the Strigoi. Is that the correct pronunciation? You were saying that they were vulnerable to be turned into Strigoi if they did things that they weren't expected to do, such as marriage. I was wondering, in particularly with marriage, if men as well as women were vulnerable to that.
I've never seen, I might be totally wrong in that, I've never seen any kind of source from this period, the philosophers talking about this, are you talking about the Striges in Greece, or are you talking about the Strigoi?
With the Romani?
Oh, with the Romani. Because the Strix in Greece, I mean, that's where you're actually getting punished. Aphrodite punishes them, right, for not getting married. The idea in East Europe, it's not, it's going to be anything that you're socially supposed to do. With men, you don't actually see the idea that they get punished for marriage, for the idea that they don't get married. But like I said before, if you do die before you get married, but your job is to get married and have kids. If you die before you get married, that's when they actually do these weddings after the fact. And that's going to be for a man or a woman.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We done, or
Thank you
what do we do?
very much, Professor.